From Kielsmeyer Jones. This is translation notes, Mark 14:66 through 72. This is the handout. You should see it in the GoToWebinar control panel, but let me know if you have any issues accessing that. I have not yet uploaded it to its normal spot, tinyurl.com/marktranslationnotes, but I will. So if you're watching this later on a recording, you'll be able to access it there. If you're here live, you've got the same access to that URL as well as an upload to the handout section. If you registered today, you will also get an email with the recording as well as the handout attached. But again, anyone can go to tinyurl.com/marktranslationnotes. That just takes you to a shared Google Drive folder where I have this and all the other handouts for this series so far. You can also email me at abramkj@accordancebible.com with any questions or comments or thoughts. I'd love to interact that way as well. Just a kind of overview note of where we are in the gospel. We are nearing the end of Mark 14. In fact, this passage ends at 66 through 72. And just to take a look at this, we've got here, I'm not showing it in this heading, but Peter denies Jesus is the heading that we've got here. It's the theme of the section, and you'll see that there's really not a whole lot of, I mean, it's not a long passage is what I'm trying to say, but it of course is very significant to Peter's development, to who Jesus is, to what it might mean to be a disciple of Jesus. It's significant to Mark. But we're going to take it in two parts. The NA28 gives us a paragraph marker here, so we get 3 verses today, and then the final 4 verses next time. That will take us through the end of Mark 14, leaving us with Mark 15 and Mark 16. I also, after we get through Mark, I will circle back and we'll cover Mark 3, most of Mark 3, which I had not done before, and I found 2 verses in Mark 1 that we did not do. So we'll do some cleanup to be consistent and make sure that we've covered the whole book. But we are at the 4-year mark this week of this translation notes series, if you can believe it. And again, all those handouts are at tinyurl.com/marktranslationnotes. So we begin with a new passage today, Mark 14:66. Let me just go to Accordance and catch us up from last time just a little bit. We had seen this significant passage where, and I'll just look at the English translation here, where Jesus is on trial in a manner of speaking. It's a sham trial, and the abusive treatment of him is front and center here. What he had predicted about his suffering is beginning to take place. He had this profound prophecy, this forward-looking prophecy, this prediction coming from the Hebrew prophets and saying, I am the Son of Man who will come again with the clouds in heaven. And we ended last time with some spitting on him, blindfolding him, striking him, telling him to prophesy, the guards taking him and beating him. So a pretty intense scene, and Jesus is just being treated awfully, of course, through no fault of his own. We had in this long passage that was mostly about Jesus, we'd had this kind of brief flyover of Peter in verse 54. And we pick up with this theme today. We had seen in Mark, Peter had followed Jesus from a distance up to the high priest's courtyard. He was sitting with the guards and warming himself by the fire. And the word Mark uses there is therminomenos, thermino, to warm oneself. We'll see that same word again today in verse 66. So this is going to be a continuation of verse 54, where Mark just gave us this one verse insert, almost an aside, because as we saw a few weeks ago, verse 53 was all about the Sanhedrin coming together with Jesus in front of the high priest. And then verse 55 is talking about this, can't even call it a trial, but it's talking about this interaction. And so this verse 54 that Mark had just kind of highlighted and then panned away from, now he goes back to what was happening there. So we pick up there in Mark 14:66. So it's a new scene in the sense that we move away from the courtroom scene, but it is almost a recapitulation or a further development of this one line, this one verse that Mark had given us before with Peter. So let's look at accordance, starting in verse 66. And I'll go left to right. I'm going to close the English text and make this font nice and large. Kai antas tu Petru, kato en te aule, erketai mia ton paidiskon tu archiereos. Tu archiereos. So going left to right, we read, and or now being Peter down in the courtyard or below the courtyard, comes, so present middle indicative. We've seen this from Mark before. He uses this present tense, even though he's describing a past narrative. It lends some vividness, perhaps. Comes or arrives one of the servants or slaves of the high priest. And then the sentence doesn't end here because we have a Kai here. The NA28 editors give us no punctuation. And in fact, this is a twofold action because this servant girl or woman comes, I guess we have girl with the P-A-I-D root, but she comes and she says. So it's a twofold action, but we just get the first part in verse 66. So here's how I've translated it. Now, while Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servants of the high priest came over. And I have a couple of things in brackets there, you'll see in my translation. Well, one is in parentheses, that's female, and that's from Mia. If we go to accordance and hover over Mia, or maybe we remember that that's the feminine form of one. So I just want to note that. Now, what we do in translation is a decision for us to make, but it is, and I'm skipping ahead here, we'll cover all these bullet points, but Mia is feminine, both in grammatical gender and in social gender or sex. She's a female human. So some translations will bring that out more specifically and give us servant girl so that we know. And the Mia does that. Again, Mia is both grammatically feminine and it's socially, you could call it socially feminine, or it's describing a female. And I make that distinction because, as we've seen, there are in Greek, nouns and adjectives have gender that may not in English, and they're simply grammatical gender. And it's the same thing in a language like Spanish. And this is one of the first things that people have to get used to, is that, for example, in the Lord's Prayer, Jesus prays, yours is the kingdom and the glory, and la gloria in Spanish, it's feminine, but it doesn't mean that there's anything male or female about glory. It's just how it works with a noun. Well, that's true with Mia, except that it's of a person too. So this is a female person, and the only translation decision here is whether to bring that out in translation or not. I've kind of, well, I haven't made a final translation here. I just put this in parentheses so we could see it. But some translations will say servant girl to make clear following from Mark's Mia. So she is the subject of this sentence. She's the subject of this verse and the next one, but Peter's here. And so we might ask, how does he relate to her? And we want to do that at the grammatical level. I think the easiest way to show this is, well, the two things. One is the instant details, and the other is the diagrams. Maybe you don't need the instant details. Whether you do or not, ontos is a participle. It's a verbal participle. And it's, you can see the parsing in the instant details below. It's present participle, masculine, singular, genitive. So it does not go with Mia because Mia is feminine. It's also in the nominative because she's a subject. So ontos is not going with Mia. If it's masculine, we ask who's masculine, what word is masculine, and in fact, this is a male person too, and it's Peter. And we also have the case matching, as we would expect. So we get the Omicron sigma ending there of the genitive participle of emi, and we get the u, the genitive ending of tu and petru, So this all goes together as one phrase. And it would literally or more woodenly be translated, now being Peter below the courtyard, comma, a servant girl came. But we can't do that in English because that is confusing as to who the subject actually is. So this is in Greek what's called the genitive absolute. And we've seen this before. And again, it's the way to understand it is Peter being below the courtyard, but you can't do that in English because that makes Peter the subject. And he is the subject, so to speak, of being below in the courtyard, but he's not the subject of what follows. And in Greek, the main actor, the main subject is the servant girl. So this genitive absolute, I've just put this in from the Pocket New Testament Greek dictionary. And again, we've seen it multiple times in Mark. This Greek dictionary defines it as a clause that contains a participle, check, ontos, and almost always a substantive or a noun. We have that, check, to Petru, Peter. Both in the genitive case, saw that, check, os, u, and that is usually grammatically unrelated to the rest of the sentence, also check. And that explains why we cannot bring this into English, because if we started with now Peter being, which is how I would go, going left to right, I would do that. But we run into this erketai, which does not go with Peter, it goes with Mia. Erketai is a verb, and so the main verb, it takes a nominative, Mia, and so we have to figure out what to do with this. Well, set it apart with the comma, treat it as if it's its own, and not sentence, but it's its own clause, and it is related to the rest of the sentence. It's very much related, or else Mark wouldn't mention it. It's just not grammatically connected. And again, that's why we have so much trouble bringing it over into English, because there's not really an equivalent category in English, or at least not that works the same way. That's the genitive absolute. And so all of that you could see that one way in the instant details, or if you're still struggling, I get hung up on these sometimes, and I'll open up the diagram tool in a parallel pane. And the way that the diagrams in Accordance will do this is it will put the genitive absolute in brackets here to show you that this is really its own grammatical construction. And in fact, you've got, as you do in this diagram, this horizontal line split by the vertical line, at the left of which is the subject or the substantive, the noun, at the right of which is the verb. So Peter being below in the courtyard. So that's all there. Got a subject and a verb, but it's in brackets because it's not really connected. It's coming off here, this erketai, but this erketai belongs to the Mia, Mia ton paidiskon. The erketai does not belong to Peter. So the way the diagrams show this is it connects it. Maybe a dotted line would make this a little clearer, but they use the brackets to show that it's not grammatically connected. All right, so that's the genitive absolute, and I like to review that whenever it comes up, because I think it's enough of a potentially unfamiliar category to us that, of course, by now we've seen it, but it's always good to review it a little bit, I think. So let's finish up with Peter before we move to this servant. So where was Peter? Well, he was kato en te ale. He was below in the courtyard. And I noted at the beginning that Mark is picking up Peter's story from verse 54 of this same chapter, which had said, and Peter followed him from a distance, him being Jesus, right into the courtyard of the high priest. And he was sitting with the guards and warming himself by the fire. So this same warming himself verb from 54 is going to come up in just a moment. This te aule, we could look and see, is that the same? Easiest way to do that, I think, right click, search for, and just jump ahead to Mark in your range or your go-to. And it's sure enough, it's the same word used in verse 54. So Mark is giving us a clear lexical connection with these two words. But in terms of the narrative, we we remember probably, oh yeah, he did mention Peter not that long ago, and so now he's picking it up in the courtyard. So that's where we are. Let's talk about this servant girl. She comes, and then we've got the verb here first, and then the subject. And erkatai is part one of what she does, and lege is part two. So she comes and she says, and you might just think about, do you want to say she came over, she arrived, she showed up? Erkatai can just mean she came, but you'll see, like in the NET translation, I think it had came by. Yeah, it has come by. So you might just consider if came alone makes sense, or if you need another helping word like came by or came over or showed up or something like that. The NET Bible, the NET Bible, puts a period here, which you could do, and you also don't have to. It just depends on how lengthy an English sentence you're okay with in translation. But that's the first verb used of her, is that she comes over. So she is in the scene now, having had Peter. The camera zooms back to Peter, and so we're picking up from verse 54. That's what Mark is doing here. And now somebody else enters the frame, and it's this female servant of the high priest. We can, from the commentaries, we can presume maybe she's on break or something. She's just coming over to warm up for a minute. She's doing something as a servant, but over here she's coming over, and she's going to interact with Peter. But before we get to that, let me just pause there and see what questions or comments that brings up for you as we look at this opening verse, which again, the sentence is not done. But what questions or comments do you have on anything we've covered or any part of this verse that we didn't go over? And if there are no questions, we'll just pause for a beat, and then we'll move on to the next verse. All right, on to verse 67. So we have this kai and lege, which is the main verb. Again, the two parts of her action are coming over and seeing, but then we get some participles that are subordinate to this seeing. I'm sorry, to this saying. So let's just start with Greek. We'll look at the diagrams again to see how this all fits together. There's a lot of verbs here, and we want to make sure we understand how they work together. Kai idusa ton petron, thermainomenon, emblepsasa auto lege, kai su meta tu Nazarenu estha tu Jesu. And seeing Peter warming himself, he looked right at him and said, or really what we have is, and seeing Peter warming himself, looking right at him, ing for participle, looking right at him, she says, also you with the Nazarene were Jesus, namely Jesus, or Nazarene, comma, Jesus. We're going to have to do some smoothing out of simply interlinear translation. Going left to right won't make sense. So here's what I've put down for my translation. And seeing Peter warming himself by the fire in brackets, whether you think we need that or not, that's up to you. And seeing Peter warming himself by the fire, she looked right at him and said, you also were with the Nazarene Jesus. So let's talk about the verbs first, just to know where we are and who's doing what, and then we'll talk about things at the word level too. But there are two verbal participles, idusa and emblepsasa. There we go. Both of these verbal participles, you can see the sigma alpha ending. They're feminine. They are, let me just pull up the full parsing. They're nominative, they're singular, so they clearly go with this same Mia, this servant girl, and they modify, in this case, the saying. So you could ask with the participle, in what way is she saying, or when is she saying, or what else is happening while she's saying? Well, she's seeing him and she's looking right at him. If you want, again, to open the diagrams, you'll see how this subordination is symbolized. So we had the erketai, this is verse 65, and then we've got this, so remember, this is part of a compound two-part verb. Lege is here, and then idusa and emblepsasa come underneath it as grammatically subordinate. And a wooden translation would be, and seeing Peter warming himself by the fire, looking at him, she says, and then you give the quote. Now, that if that sounded odd in English, that's because it is. And our participles in English don't, they can't carry quite as much weight as they do in Greek. So the question is, what do we do with this? Do we split it up into sentences? Or what I think is the case is that we understand this as either one or two participles of attendant circumstance. We looked at this, I think, last week or the week before, or maybe both, because we had a bunch of these in the last passage. But in short, and you could look this up more in a grammar if you wanted to, but in short, these participles of attendant circumstance, they are participles. And if you're diagramming, they are subordinate to the verb. They're describing the same actor, the same subject, which is Mia, ton, pai, diskon, etc. And so they're grammatically subordinate, but you can translate a participle of attendant circumstance as if it's on the same line as lege. In other words, you've got erketai, lege, and you could essentially bring this down and make this a triple or even quadruple compound verb, so that you've got her coming over, you've got her saying, you've got her seeing, you've got her looking right at him, but all of those could be indicative verbs. I translated it as, and seeing Peter warming himself, she looked right at him and said, but you could even go one more and say, and she saw Peter warming himself and looked right at him and said, or when she saw Peter warming himself. I don't think any of these are bad translations, and different translations that you may have in accordance will do this differently. But what is being described by Mark here is essentially a sequential series of verbs, even though two are participles, one's a main verb. But here, after she shows up, so that's step one, that's verb one, she shows up. Verb two, she sees Peter. Verb three, she looks right at him, so she chooses to engage with him. And then she does more than just looking at him, then she talks to him, she said. So that's the fourth verb. I think when it comes to things like participles of attendant circumstance, to me, what governs the decision here is what reads the best in English. And I didn't put this in the handout, but as you know, I also want to be as faithful to the Greek as possible. We want like a high fidelity recording, while also recognizing that we're not actually live. We're not in Greek, we're in English. And so some grammatical categories and practices just don't exist in English. And this is a good example where the participle can do much more in Greek than it can here. All right, so what does she see? Whom does she see? We get a double accusative there. So the object of her seeing, so this first participle, idusa, ton petron, thermainomenon. We see the double accusative here, although you could really think of this as both a subject and a verb within the accusative. So she sees Peter, so he is in the accusative case, masculine singular accusative, and then she sees him doing something, which is warming himself. Double accusative there. And it's interesting here, and I don't know why this is the case. I'd be curious your thoughts. I mean, I suppose we could speculate some, but Mark does not exactly repeat what he had said about Peter before. If we go back to the previous verse, we had that he was warming himself pros ta phos, by the light or by the fire. Now, here in verse 67, we just get that he was warming himself. And it's interesting that NET Bible finds that sufficient. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked directly at him. Other translations will clarify that he's warming himself by the fire. I put that in brackets here because it's not in Mark's Greek. But the question is, and I think we may have different answers on this, or you may even have a different answer depending on how much time you spend with this passage. The question is, do you want to put by the fire in the translation or not? It's not there in the Greek. Nobody argues that. The question is, does this make sense in English? NET Bible thinks, yes, when she saw Peter warming himself, that makes perfect sense. And maybe that does in English to you as well. Either way, Mark had clarified in verse 54. If you had this verse right after verse 54, I would have, to me, it wouldn't even be a question. You would just say warming himself. I think what raises this question to me, this question of do we put in by the fire, is a lot of verses have now separated it. So do we kind of treat this more as it needs the introduction of how is he warming himself? Is he rubbing his hands together? Is he jumping up and down? Well, maybe he's doing those things too, but he's by the fire. The NET, like I said, does not do this. If you go to live click, you could see, click on your verse reference, see it once. Here, the Berean Bible gives us warming himself there. Common English Bible, warming himself by the fire. Other translations are just fine with warming himself, and maybe you are as well. Not an enormously significant decision when it comes to the exegesis of this. But actually, I'm seeing a lot of translations that are just fine with warming himself. So that's one of many decisions to make here. But it is interesting that Mark doesn't say it the same way he did before. And by the way, if you triple click on this, this word to see it in a lexicon, another question is, does this Greek word already contain within itself the implication of fire? And in BDAG, it's kind of funny here. You get warm oneself as the translation equivalent. So if you follow BDAG, you do what a lot of these other translations do and just say warm himself. But you also have add a fire as part of the definition. So it's maybe encoded in that word already, in which case you've got one Greek word taking 5 English words to translate it, and that's fine. I mean, the goal here is not the same word count. That's impossible. But that's what she's seeing Peter doing, warming himself. She sees him, and then it's interesting that we get 2 seeing verbs here, these 2 participles, idousa and emblepsasa. These would be words that I'd look at because what I think I don't want to do probably is translate it as, and seeing Peter, she saw him and said. These are 2 different Greek verbs. Idousa comes from horao, which is just your sort of run-of-the-mill to see, to perceive, to notice is a translation equivalent here. So that's the first one. And then if we look at emblepsasa, triple click that, you've got emblepo, and in fact, blepo is see, and we have this prefix here, which in Greek, when you have a preposition prefixed to a verb, it tends to bring some intensifying effect to the table. And you'll see in BDAG, it will say that, to look at something directly and therefore intently. So this is not just blepo, this is not just horao, this is to gaze on, to look at. So she sees him and then she looks right at him. I would not leave a translation as she saw him and looked at him and said. That's really, I don't think that's bringing out the full force of this verb. So she's seeing him, she's noticing him. We could think of this as 2 kinds of seeing, and this works in English, maybe matches our experience. You might see something and it doesn't really register, or you might see something and look away and choose not to engage that thing. So that first kind of seeing is more of a just noticing. It's almost more of a purely biological, viewing of Peter warming himself. But this next verb, she's looking right at him. And I put this translation equivalent here in the handout, so you could have that handy. That's from emblepo. So she looks right at him, and now we're gonna get to this main verb of said. So she directs some speech toward him. So she looked right at him, or looked directly at him, or looked intently at him. I don't know about gazing on. It's not like, I don't think the point is she's staring at him. The point is it's like laser focus. She's not like gawking at him, staring at him for a long time. So gaze, I'm not sure I would use that here. But it's just this, she's looking right at him, and then she says, Kaisu meta tu Nazarenu esta tu Yesu. And you also were with the Nazarene, that is Jesus. Let's actually pause there. I see some questions in the chat or comments, and I want to respond to those. So we're going to come to the content of her speech in just a moment. Yeah, here, let me put this in the chat. Somebody says, the servant girl of the high priest was an eyewitness of Peter, part of the mob arrest in the garden. Hence the travel coming verb used in verse 66. As she arrived back from the Garden of Gethsemane, she stares at him in verse 67. Yeah, Mark does raise an interesting question for us, which is, how does she know this? Where did she see him? And the way I would satisfy this curiosity that I have is I would first stick very close to the text and see, can I find this servant girl mentioned as a servant girl in the text somewhere else? And so I would take Paidiskon, I'd right click, I'd search for the lexeme. And this verse 66 is the first time I have this word. Now it's possible that there's another Greek synonym used here, but in fact, unless I've missed something, I am almost certain this is the first mention of this character in Mark. So what we don't get, unlike this word warming himself or courtyard, what we don't get is a lexical link to know where she is or where she saw him. So we can, then we're left with a little bit more of interpretation. Would it be natural for the chief priests to have their servants with them at all times? Was this one with them? Mark doesn't say explicitly, but that interpretation makes sense. As far as maybe she saw him here, maybe she saw him at the garden, maybe she saw him somewhere before that. Mark doesn't say for sure. I think France had a comment on this. Let me just get to him and see. I'll just find what he said. Presumes that she recognizes Peter because she has seen him with Jesus before, perhaps in Gethsemane, but more likely as one of the Galilean group who had been a prominent feature in the temple precincts during the days leading up to Passover. Again, we don't get hard and fast textual evidence for that, but he lists that garden encounter as possible, and also they've just kind of been around. So Mark doesn't tell us, but Mark does confirm that she's right, because well, actually Mark doesn't confirm it, Peter denies it, but the way that she says it is not with a question. She says it with a statement, so there's no real question. She's going to say it again. So she is quite sure, and the rest of the passage will have that unfold. So even if we don't know where she saw him, or even if she doesn't say right here, we do get a level of certainty that she knows who he is. Yeah, it's not like she says, I saw you with him there. She just says, you were with him. This man is one of them. You must be one of them. And this would be worth comparing with the parallel accounts to see, do we get more information about her? Here's a comment I'll put in the chat. Somebody says there may have been several fires or warming spots and spots for light, so it may not be the same place in the courtyard. Adding fire almost implies it is the same fire, which needs not be the case. That's an interesting thought. Yeah. Another comment, she arrives back after Peter. Peter was already existing there, verse 66. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so he's already there. Oh yeah, here's a comment. Thanks for putting this in. Someone puts the comment on the parallel, John 18:26. We'll just pull that up briefly. Yeah, there you go. Did I not see you in the orchard with him? One of the high priest's slave. And we get this in John, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off. So again, we don't know her motivations for sure. I mean, I don't think we ever know another human's motivations, but that's to pontificate. Mark doesn't tell us, John doesn't tell us the motivations, but you do wonder the relative being mentioned here. There's a closeness there. I mean, she probably was like, you would be upset about that. And so one wonders if she's doing this to get him in trouble or because she's mad or whatever. I mean, again, that's going beyond the text. It's interesting to think about. Yeah, John definitely fills out the identity and where she saw him before. Mark does not. So as always, we have the parallel gospels to look at this and get more information. In translation, we just give us what Mark has and go on from there. All right, let's get back to the content of her speech. So with the Nazarene, you were Jesus. Meta tu Nazarenu, esta tu Jesu. With the Nazarene, you were Jesus. The NET Bible has that Nazarene. Let's just go back to the right verse. Yeah, you were also with that Nazarene, Jesus. You could do it that way for sure, or just the Nazarene, but the that gives us this almost this disdain. You know, it's not just that she's trying to point out a specific person with the, but there's a disdain to it. So whether, if you're sure of that, then translate it with that. If you're not, you can translate it with the Nazarene, Jesus. I mean, there's no question who she's talking about. The only question is how disdainfully is she talking about him. France says, in describing Jesus as Ha Nazarenas, the title by which he has already been publicly described outside the circle of his own followers, she emphasizes the foreign distinctiveness of this northern group, as the bystanders will repeat in verse 70. So we'll see more about this. You must be one of them because you also are a Galilean. This will give us a good opportunity to do what little bit of background research we might need to do to understand what's going on here. But there is this dismissiveness already. And again, I noted this, she does not ask whether he was with Jesus. She knows she saw him with Jesus. And so there's no question here, she says that. There is an alternate form here, and we'll close the verse with this, unless you've got other questions or comments, which I'd love to hear. Eistha, if that looked odd to you, that's because it rarely occurs. It looked odd to me too. I mean, in context, you can kind of figure that it has to do with some kind of being. But the verb here, sorry, let me just pull this up again. Here it is. If you hover over this, you can see in the instant details, it's from a me, it's imperfect, indicative, second person singular. She's talking to Peter. That part is clear. It does not occur very often. If we search for this inflected form, we just see it twice. Whereas if we were to search for, why don't we try it this way, a me, and then add a tag. Let's try this. I'm gonna right click, enter tag, and I'm gonna do verb. We want second person singular, and let's just leave it at that. That we get 114 hits, and so we get we get the A form. What we're seeing here is an alternate form. I looked in some grammars, which I was able to do via the info pane, to see that basically this is just an alternate inflection, and it occurs only twice in the Greek New Testament, and both are in the same story here and in Matthew. Now, do we conclude anything from that? I don't. I mean, I think it's just an alternate form. But if you wanted to look at this more, because sometimes when we read Greek, we want to use it as a chance to review our verb charts, or maybe something confused us enough that we thought, well, I actually don't know the imperfect form of a me in any person or number. So I found this from the info pane. If you open up the info pane and go to the grammars, you'll see I'm going to click open mounts. I'm going to hold, actually I don't have to hold command, I can just click it. And mounts says there's an alternate form eistha that occurs only twice. Alternate form of what? Well, this is a footnote. We can click on the footnote to get us back to the part of the grammar that he's referring to. And here's the imperfect of eimi. And eis is what we would have expected. And in fact, we can go back to this search now and add imperfect, second person singular imperfect, and see the other form. Eis, eistha is there, but it's otherwise 6 out of 8 times it's this eis form. So that's what we would have memorized in Greek. Decker shows the same thing. If you click him open, he lists this same example. And by the way, just from the info pane, what we're doing is looking up the grammars by reference. So if 1467 is in the grammar, it will take us there. Fortunately, both of these address this question, and Decker just notes the same thing. So you also were with him. I do think we can conclude from the imperfect form, this is kind of an ongoing durative, you were with him, like not just happened to be in the same space as him, but I think the implication there is that you were like following him, you were part of his party. I think something like that would make sense. Although I'm not sure I would bring that out in translation. I would just leave it like this. You also were with the Nazarene Jesus. The eistha does split the two Nazarenu to Yesu. I don't know whether that leads to any emphasis or not, but both of these, Nazarene and Jesus, are in the genitive, so it goes together. It's being governed by this with. You were with the Nazarene, Jesus, or the Nazarene that is Jesus, or the Nazarene called Jesus. Any number of ways you could translate this. Let's see what questions or comments you have before we move on to our last verse of the day. Interesting. All right, let me put this in the chat. Somebody says, I disagree about dismissiveness used by the article. To Nazarenu, this needs more research. I would think the article is giving previous reference usage. What do you think the article is doing with to Yesu? Dismissive again? Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I think what I would do as far as previous usage is I would search this word. So I would start with Nazarene and see where that was last used. You might even consider, is that used in derogatory context? Now that doesn't necessarily decide whether it's the or that here, but it is last used in Mark 10:47. So, and we get 6 uses. We'll get more in verse 6. Now it's interesting here, leave us alone, Jesus the Nazarene, Jesus the Nazarene. Yeah, so this is kind of a fraught, negative context, but with Jesus going up against the demonic forces. Here it's just Mark using it. Here it's this woman using it, and then the angels use it, or the guy at the tomb uses it. So yeah, we can't decide from context whether this word by itself is inherently derogatory. And even if it were, that doesn't mean it's that Nazarene. So yeah, I do think that's a question of interpretation, and I agree that would be worth more research. I don't know if the NET is the only one that does that. The Nazarene, I'm seeing. Yeah, that may be the only translation that does that. Oh, the NIV does it too. Okay. Yeah, I agree. I think that's worth further exploration. And I think you all know, who have been here before, that my default tends to be more cautious or conservative in translation. Conservative in the sense of, if I'm not fully convinced that it's that, I'll translate it as the, which is how I ended up with it here. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. That's a great comment. Any other comments or questions on verse 47, and then we'll move to the last verse of today. Verse 68, ha de ernesata legon, ute oida ute epistamai su ti leges, kai ezelthen etho esta pro aulion kai elector e phonesen. But he denied, saying, neither do I know, nor do I understand what you are saying, or what you are saying, with maybe some emphasis there with the Sioux. And he went outside of the front of the courtyard. We'll come back to that. And the rooster crowed, or made a sound. But he denied, and we'll come back to whether it or him goes in here, saying, I neither know nor understand what you are saying. And he went out of the front of the courtyard, and a rooster crowed. You'll notice I obviously am not done with my translation here. This is not anything that would be, in a presentable, shareable form outside of hopefully this webinar. But I raised there's three questions I have that aren't crystal clear to me. The first one is, do you fill out the he denied with an object of some sort? I think the good English usage pretty much requires it. Otherwise, you're just saying, but he denied saying. So that's one question. The other question is, how do we translate this ta proalion? And we've got this same root for courtyard, and this pra gives us the front. So maybe it's front of the courtyard. We'll come back to that. And then the third major question is what's in brackets here. And that's a question of, is this part of the earliest attainable text? And so do we bring it out in translation? But let's start with, but he denied. Mark doesn't give us an object of the denial. It's implied. And I've noted this before because we've seen it so much in Mark. It's more frequent in Greek to see an elided or left out object of a verb than it is in English. Like I say, I don't think it makes good English sense to say, but he denied saying. You could do it, but I think more likely than not, your reader's going to trip up over it. So I think, yes, you do bring out the object in translation, even though it's not there in Greek. The next question would be, so if you agree with that, if you go that way, the next question would be denied it or denied him. Well, again, it's not in Greek, so we have to decide from context. I think most translations have denied it, and I think that's right. The most immediate referent to it would be what the servant girl said, namely that Peter was with Jesus. So verse 67, you were with the Nazarene Jesus, but he denied it. He denied what she said. He denied the claim. In terms of the context, though, I think you can say that he is denying Jesus, but he denied Jesus, saying, I neither know. I think that's a little bit more interpretive than what Mark is doing. I think Mark is just giving us straight up, he's denying the claim. But I do want to just bring this context in, because this is what this is about. Jesus had predicted, me aparnese, you will deny me. So there is an object there, and it's not you will deny that you know me, or you will deny what someone says about your relationship to me. It's you will deny me. And that's the prediction. We're seeing it being fulfilled here. Now, we're just doing part of the passage today, but it's going to happen again and again. But in terms of what's happening in this passage, it is exactly this. Peter is denying Jesus. That's why I've given it this heading. You'll find a lot of translations with that Peter denies Jesus heading. In translation, though, I think, but he denied it makes the most sense. I'm not sure there's a translation with, but he denied him. Like I said, I think that would be more interpretive than anything. It wouldn't be wrong. It maybe just depends on your translation philosophy. Now, interestingly, here's the King James, but he denied, saying, I know not. So that doesn't give you an object. So does what's the LSV, the Literal Standard Version? Yeah. but everything else I'm seeing is denied it. You can see with the NASB, they put it in italics because it's not in Greek. Yeah, I don't see a translation that says, but he denied him. But this is a great footnote or a great study note or a great point of conversation that he's denying the statement, but the statement is that you were with him. And so really he's denying Jesus. And yeah, here's France on that same point. The simple verb arneomai need mean no more than to say that the preceding statement is false. So that's, he denied it. But after the use of you will deny me, the reader is likely to detect also the fuller sense of disowning Jesus. And France just notes that there's a prefix to this verb here, but he says the reader may well recall Jesus's ominous words about the consequences of being ashamed of him in this generation. So is it right in terms of interpretation that a way to read this is, but Peter disowned Jesus, saying? Yes. In terms of what Mark has in the text, would I translate it that way? No, I would follow France here and keep it simple, but realize that the meaning of this is pretty profound. This is, we're not just talking about the truth or falsity of a statement. We're talking about denying a person. And Peter will do that pretty emphatically here, I think. I neither know nor understand what you are saying. So let's look at that briefly, and then we'll look at this textual issue, and I'll leave some time for questions too. But we get kind of a funny phrase here. If you look at this oida and epistemai, they both have to do with knowing. In fact, you could gloss both of these as know. I neither know nor know what you're talking about. Well, that doesn't make sense. So you need a different nuance. And so I neither know nor comprehend, know nor understand. Those might be close enough in meaning that you may follow the NET who understand this as what's called a hendiadys, which in Greek is two, that's the dis from a duo. Sorry, the hen is one, and the dia is through, and the dis is two. So if you ever forget what this word means, it's got three Greek words in it, three Greek roots. 1 through 2 is what that word means. And it's a figure of speech, the NET says, where two terms express a single meaning, usually for emphatic reasons. This is not foreign to us in English. We've got times where a good example is get up and go. Well, that's, you know, technically redundant. Like you can't go somewhere without getting up if you were sitting down. So that might just be emphasizing like, really, you need to go. That's how the NET reads this. And if you agree and see it the same way, then what you would do is render the two verbs as one, and then some way to bring out emphasis. So even is what they've done here. So they've taken oida and epistemai, rendered it as understand. I don't even understand what you're talking about. But it notes in the footnote that in Greek, I do not know or understand what you are saying. And I've just been cautious here just so we can see the correspondence to the Greek, but in a final translation, that would be a decision. Do you read this as hendiadys or not? I would compare translations and commentaries to get a sense of this. Maybe also, and this would be a broader project, but maybe also how often does Mark use hendiadys? That's not super straightforward to search. Maybe you search your Greek commentaries for this word, but that would be another consideration. Regardless of how we translate this, in terms of the meaning of it, I mean, colloquially, we can think of this as Peter denying Jesus up and down already. And that's especially true given the repeated denials that come when we return to this passage next week. But there's a real clear, I've seen you there, says the servant girl. She's not asking. And then there's a real clear denial. France just notes this is virtually tautologous, a rhetorical device to strengthen the force of the denial. Let's just briefly talk about kai elector ephonesen. It is in brackets. The place that I would look for this, there are two places I would go for this. One would be in my, I would actually open up an NA28 with Sigla if you've got that. So I'll go to NA28 with Sigla, and you can see here, not just brackets, but you've got some notation. So I'm going to click that open to open the apparatus in its own window. Now, if I have forgotten what all of these jots and tittles, so to speak, or squares and slashes mean, Accordance will tell me. If I hover over, it says here, the words, clauses, or sentences between these two signs are omitted by the witnesses cited. So everything between this raised square and the raised slash is omitted by these witnesses, these manuscripts, and hovering over each of them will show you in accordance what they are. Clicking it open will take you to the part of the apparatus that has more information about that. So I'll just kind of leave that there. I know we're giving this a very cursory glance, but then you get into text criticism. Which manuscripts do you think are more reliable? The brackets here in the surface text mean that ultimately the translators themselves or the compilers of the NA28, there was enough uncertainty that they did what I do when I'm uncertain, which is you put it in brackets, or like the NASB does italics. That's not to say that there's a question about translation. It's just to say there's a question of if it's in the Greek text to begin with. The translation part's pretty easy. The rooster sounded or crowed. The question is, does this belong in the text? The other resource I would check is Metzger, who has a text commentary, who basically says difficult to decide, and gives some more information. In the face of this, the committee decided that the least unsatisfactory solution, don't you love that? The least unsatisfactory solution, the less bad solution, was to include the words in the text but enclose them within square brackets. Let's stop there and see what questions or comments you have, and we'll wrap up. Yeah, here somebody mentions Comfort textual commentary gives a nice summary of the rooster crowed. Oh, interesting. Comfort has more doubtful. Let's see. Let me just go here, Mark 14:68. And a rooster crowed. Yeah, and he's got, yeah, he doesn't give a rating per se that I can see. But yeah, very, very similar. So Comfort, Metzger. There's a summary or application of Metzger. What is it? Manson text guide. That's very similar. In fact, it's based on Metzger, more with translators in mind. So I think the idea is that this version is a little bit more accessible. But if you've got Metzger, I don't think you would also need Manson. There's also Comfort that you could look at. Great. Well, let's wrap up. If you've got other questions or comments, I will gladly take them. But just to say that we're very much mid-passage here. Although already, I mean, this is pretty ominous that the rooster crows, whether we think this is in the text or not. I mean, he has denied Jesus emphatically. So rooster or not, this is bad. The prediction is coming, more of Jesus's predictions are coming true. And we're going to see some back and forth here. Next week, the servant girl comes right back up again in verse 69. So I expect that we'll cover the next 4 verses next time, which will take us to the end of the chapter. So I look forward to seeing you then. I'm going to end the recording and stay on for just a moment. So if you're on the recording, again, you can go to tinyurl.com/marktranslationnotes for this handout, or you can reach out to me in email.